हेलो हेलो।
हाँ, स्ट्रीम तो शुरू हो गया।
Namaste and welcome to all the viewers to another live stream on Nava Vimarsh. So today we will be discussing a very different topic from the one of the topics which we have discussed earlier. So yes, I would like to welcome Swarajya Krantikari, Rishi, and Nocturnal Patriot ones.
Namaste, Harsani.
Namaskaram, Abhijit.
नमस्ते
Right.
नमस्ते।
So namaste. So without any delay, we shall begin with the presentation as well. So today's topic is something quite different from what we have discussed before. As you can see, we are going to look at one of history's most celebrated stories of modernization, that is particularly the Meiji Restoration in Japan. And we are going to ask a question that almost nobody asks at this time, that we have the standard narrative of the Meiji Restoration and the modernization of Japan in mind, right? But are we actually reading the nature of this event correctly? For example, uh, many of us see that Japan is often held up, especially in India, as the model of what a non-Western or Asian nation can do if it gets modernization done right. The kind of rapid transformation of the industrial economy it propped up, the kind of military power it became, also the preservation of its sovereignty while the rest of Asia was colonized during the 1900s. On the surface of it, it looks like quite a huge triumph in their history. And in a very specific sense and from a specific lens, it really was a triumph as well. But we would also like to explore a new angle to this whole event today. This success story, uh, uh, for whom was it a success story in particular, and judged by which values in particular? And if it was a success story, like many success stories elsewhere, what was the price for it? Not just economically of being an industrial economy or politically of being turning into a different kind of state, but this civilizational cost. What was exactly lost in the cultural domain and so on in this success? So today we will be examining this from what is called a traditionalist or a perennialist perspective. If that phrase is unfamiliar, don't worry. I shall be explaining that earlier in the later section. My argument is that once you look at the Meiji Restoration through this particular lens, the picture that emerges from it is dramatically different from what we actually think about it. So yes, let's begin. Any starting thoughts from the rest of you?
Yeah, so I think it will be an interesting investigation today because, as you said, generally within our so let's take context of India. So even in political circles, especially the non-left, we see a lot of admiration towards Japan, and there is this phrase, or rather, we should say, a framing which is used to show how India should become. Like there is uh, this project as well of Kyotoization. Many of the political Twitter artists will know what I'm talking about. So this is the ideal picture which is being shown to every single non-left audience by its leaders all the time when they are trying to show as to how we should be approaching our modernity. So yeah, this will be something very interesting because it's a new lens which will be used today. Generally, we do not in this channel, and even in previous discussions as well, we have not never used this lens at all. So it's very new for me as well. So let's see how it goes. I'm thinking it will be as amazing as Nenner has hinted to us.
And also, before adopting any model, it's always wise to see how success, I mean, the true success measure of the model uh, is evident when we see how much, I mean, when we are able to measure its performance. And the actual performance measure of the model will be revealed when we see how much Japan lost itself, I mean, how much of its score did Japan lose while adopting this model. So, based on that, we can take a wise decision as to how much of Japan's model should we mimic for our journey. So, yeah, that way we can be intelligent about our decisions, I believe.
Yes. So with that, we can begin with our presentation. So here we begin. Before we look at Japan at all, I want to do something methodological here. I want to pause and examine the framework in which we establish success stories overall, whether it's Meiji Restoration or in our own Indian case, which we evaluate usually as a not a success story. So just I would like the audience to think about it, what it means to call something a success. Usually it means that it achieves what it was trying to achieve, that it means that what was achieved was worth achieving. And both of these claims, they have these hidden assumptions. Those hidden assumptions are driven by particular values in all cases. So now, going back to the case of Japan, the standard narrative of Meiji Restoration says that Japan modernized rapidly, became an industrial and military power, avoided colonization, then even joined the ranks of the civilized nations, quote unquote. To them, and to many of us as well, that reads as a plain success. But only, and this is my first point, only this is a success if you have already accepted a very specific set of values. The what are these values then? The values would be that the value of an industrial power over other forms of strength. Then there will be the value of the nation state as the highest form of political organization, which Japan achieved. Then would be the value of material progress as the primary measure of civilizational health. Then, even in the Enlightenment sense, the value of individual freedom over all else. However, these values, when you introspect a bit and think about it, they are not truly universal. These are very specific products of 18th and 19th century European intellectual history. These are particularly the values of the Enlightenment. And often it is said about how Japan modernized, yet preserved its culture and so on. However, I would like to make the opposite argument that Meiji leaders, they did not just borrow Western technology, but they were also consciously importing this entire framework for evaluating what counts as progress. And in uh, importing this entire framework, they made a serious mistake with their own epistemology and you can say the core civilizational values. So that is what we will be examining today. So not just about what Japan did, but what values it accepted in order to do the actions it did, and whether we should accept those values in the same way they did. Yes. So that was this slide. Moving on. we come to the traditionalist and perennialist lens.
So I had this question: why this specific lens today are we choosing? There are many other, as you said, right? There are many other frameworks to choose as to how we should be analyzing this situation of modernization in Japan. So why this specific lens are we taking today?
Yeah, that is a great question. So any act of evaluation that we do that requires a particular framework, whether we do it from a, say, a critical Marxist perspective or from a liberal framework or so on, this particular lens which I have chosen, the perennialist lens that is in particular, is that this challenges the very foundations of the lens that Meiji Restoration espouses itself. So, if I were to use the lens of the Meiji Restoration itself to define itself, I would have a particularly different view and obviously a more positive view, right? This is the lens that challenges it to the maximum extent. It challenges the very value of progress itself. And it also gives us a framework to see what Japan valued itself before the Meiji Restoration. And like we were talking about earlier, we were going to discuss about the costs, right? What measure do we take for the costs? I found out that this lens is particularly useful to find out the costs because, uh, unlike others, this actually recognizes the value for what was there in the past, unlike dismissing it as backward, barbarian, feudal, and so on, which we will also debunk as we go ahead. So yeah, this lens overall is more about methodological fairness. So a little bit about the perennialist lens itself. So what is this alternative framework I'm proposing? This perennialist school of thought, it's usually associated with thinkers like Rene Guénon, then Ananda Kumaraswamy, who we have discussed in our channel once before. And it holds three core propositions. These three core propositions define every argument this perennialist school makes, basically. First is that authentic civilizations, they are always oriented towards transcendent. And what does this transcendent mean? It means that that is something that precedes and exceeds the purely human. We can call it the sacred, the divine, in our Hinduism, the Brahman. And but the overall framework is that every healthy civilization in the world, they build their institutions, their arts, culture, the social organization, even their ethics and morals. They build it oriented towards the reality of this transcendent. They cannot ignore this transcendent whenever they make such structures. That is the first point. Coming to the second point, the second proposition that perennialists make is that what we call modernity, it is actually a progressive descent from the sacred center and not a, an ascent towards progress. This is also the reason why I particularly chose this framework for to analyze the standard narrative. And this is a deliberately provocative claim, and I will build the argument for it over the course of the presentation rather than accepting it just here. Third, third argument comes up as the measure of civilization's health. Usually, people, when they talk about in a day-to-day discourse, we think about the civilization's health as, you can say, uh, maintaining peace, or you can say a healthy economy in terms of GDP, or you can say technological advancement. But is that really, you can say, a permanent goal towards working towards? The perennialist argument is that the actual measure of civilization's health is the vitality of its living connection to the transcendent. Whether the institutions that the civilization has, whether they actually still carry the genuine metaphysical meaning that they run with, and whether the people still have access to the inner life that the tradition makes possible. Not that the not that we have to fully accept this framework to find my argument about Japan compelling, but this gives a very good insight towards what we are going to study. So yes, that was the first another slide. Now here is a picture of Japan I would like to give the viewers before we move on to the Meiji Restoration itself. So what was Japan actually like before 1868? 1868 was when the Meiji Restoration actually happened. So the picture, which is obviously we should not idealize it as a perfect society or anything, but just giving a broader picture. This Tokugawa period, as it was called, gave Japan approximately 250 years of unbroken domestic peace. So, from the year 1615 until the Boshin War of 1868, that is the very year of Meiji Restoration, there was no major war in Japan at all. And that just imagine it that for a society of that scale and complexity, which was actually an urban society, a fairly developed society in its own way, this is almost without a parallel in world history. So yeah, that is a particular achievement of pre-Meiji Restoration Japan that we have to note. After this, this we talk about the spiritual life of this society before the Meiji Restoration. It was largely characterized by what the scholars call Shinbutsu Shugo, the which was a policy which stated the organic coexistence and the mutual enrichment of Buddhism and Shintoism. Usually, what happened was that Shintoism fell back on Buddhism to, you can say, relate to and understand its gods and rituals in a more deeper manner. And it was not in the standard sense of how you see in other countries, right, between, say, Islam or Christianity, between Abrahamic religions, that religions are in constant tension, competing with each other. No, that was not the case. In this system, Buddhism was basically complementary to Shintoism. It was actually expanding on it. So this you would also see shrine complexes with both Buddhist priests and Shinto priests and both kinds of deities. There would be syncretic deities. There would be it was a kind of living synthesis, if you might call it that way. Alongside this spiritual aspect, there was of course the ethical and philosophical tradition, and everyone knows about it. The moral code of the samurai, for example, Bushido, which is very famous and quite well acclaimed as well, which was in its own right actually a synthesis of Zen Buddhism and Confucian ethics. And this very well shaped the samurai class. And I shall be speaking briefly about that later as well. This period is also remarkably known for its flourishment of the artistic culture. The say, for example, the kabuki and the no arts, which are quite well known as drama in the West Indian. So this was not really so. All in all, kind of we take a step back and make an evaluation. This is not really a civilization waiting to be rescued or anything. The civilization had its own coherent narrative, and to the deepest answers, to the deepest questions of human life, it had its own answers about its own institutions, about its own structures, moral ethics, and everything. However, so what follows from 1868, we kind of see from this background. Huh.
So This, I think you have answered the question of mine. Actually, why I wanted to ask you, because what was I was curious about as to these various traditions that you have mentioned right now. Okay, uh, at least according to you, what was the direct impact of it in society? uh, these various arts and cultural movements that were going on, especially also with religious syncretism that is being shown over here, with ethical systems being mentioned by you right now. What was its direct impact on society? Because we know, right, that many modernist school would say that these societies, especially before modernization, were backward and therefore exploitative and so on. So, wanted to know on this issue, if you could please enlighten us on this.
So, the answer is not that simple because, of course, you can't measure the value of the traditions and customs of those times in, you can say, an economic or political sense. But there was a sort of, you can say, a deeper sense of meaning in everything they had. We start with, say, for example, the example of social cohesion. There was a moral concept of giri and on. So on is basically the obligations that we incur through receiving our benefits from our parents, our seniors, from nature, from our deities, from society, everything. And giri is basically the duty we must uphold to repay that obligation to them. This kind of a system, it gave every member of the society back then, no matter what their station in society was, right? For understanding what the relationship with others was. So it's not really, you didn't need say a constitution or a law book to guide them. They already had a feeling of belonging, and people understood who they were in relation to others, and what those relationships meant in a more, you can say, in a more meaningful way.
So they were able to make a decentralized, self-sustaining system without need of uh, external implementation as such, right?
Yes, but you can also say that they did fall back on their Buddhist priests and Buddhist literature to guide their morals and so on. So that was there.
Okay, okay, okay.
Hmm. So this is another slide. We move on to the next topic. Here is a painting from the pre-Meiji Restoration era of, I think, girls being taught music, you know, in a traditional Japanese setup. Right. So the next topic would be, before we also need to dismantle the word before we get to 1868, to understand what was there before the Meiji Restoration. So the period from 1603 to 1868, which is called Tokugawa Japan, it is routinely described in various ways. For example, the common description of it is as a rigid class hierarchy or as a feudal society. However, this word feudal in particular, it carries a lot of hidden weight. It implies a lot of things that we automatically kind of think. Even in our Indian context, this comes to mind that feudal means backward, feudal means irrational, feudal means oppressive, and feudal is the stage that comes before modernity. So you look at it carefully and you realize that we have actually already judged the society before uh, we have even described it by labeling it feudal. But the problem here is that feudalism itself is a very European historical concept, and it was actually coined to describe a very specific set of arrangements in medieval Europe. That is the relationship between lords, the knights, the serfs, and the fragmentation of political authority that was there across Europe. That the king would have less authority than the local lord, and so on, right? However, in Japan, this was not the case. In Japan, during this entire Tokugawa period, there was increasing centralization, and the emperor actually held more and more power towards the end of it. So, the fundamental assumptions of feudalism failed in this case. We have the quote from Japanese historian John Whitney Hall, who wrote in 1962 that the acceptability of applying this concept to Japan is still a matter of controversy among professional historians, notably those who study medieval Europe. And yet, we still casually do it without thinking what we are doing when we import the word. So, what does the word feudal actually mean when applied to Japan? Usually, it tends to mean, as we have discussed, about a rigid social hierarchy, political authority that was decentralized across domains, and a warrior class that had social dominance. However, these features don't into European feudalism at all. Like I mentioned, there was actually the opposite case that in Tokugawa, Japan, there was increasing political centralization across the 250 years of peace. So, yes, the evidence points to the contrary in this case. So, we have to keep in mind that we cannot condemn the Japanese pre Meiji Restoration era as a feudal era waiting to progress to an era of modernity as well. That was about this. Then we move on to an aspect of their tradition so that we understand what their worldview was more like. So, this resonates with me quite a lot because it connects directly to the point that we will bring up later, that is the loss of the samurai class. So, the standard narrative in the Meiji Restoration is that the abolition of the samurai class was obviously of a hereditary samurai class. It was obviously a progressive step towards modernity, towards everything positive, towards you can say towards equality in the modern way as we look at it. However, from a perennialist lens, this framing misses a lot of fundamentals about what the samurai actually were. So, we talk about Bunbo Ryodo here. This is the which roughly translates as the twofold way of pen and sword. This was not just a metaphor or anything. It actually described a genuinely integrated discipline of self-cultivation, which was, of course, derived from Confucian ethics in particular, and also from Zen Buddhism. During the reign of During the time of Tokugawa Japan, there were around 200 domain schools across Japan that actually taught a curriculum to samurai that combined the Confucian ethics and moral philosophy, classical literature, poetry, calligraphy, Zen Buddhist meditation, martial arts, and everything. And you might think, what are samurai doing learning all this? So
Indeed.
that's when the framing that earlier that they were a warrior aristocracy, that misses the whole point. They were not just that. They were actually kind of institutional vessel to carry an entire philosophical and even spiritual tradition, and that they carried from generation to generation by virtue of being hereditary. So, among the ethical traditions of that time was which is celebrated even now is Bushido, which is of course not implemented in practice anymore, but still celebrated. One of the greatest theorists of Bushido, Yamaga Soko, he actually describes the samurai's function as being the exemplary human being for the rest of society. So the earlier depiction that we try to portray, that with the abolition of samurai, there would be a progressive move towards equality and so on. This would challenge that narrative itself, because society kind of loses the, you can say, the exemplary human being it was supposed to look up to. There is another example, that another writer, Miyamoto Musashi, he writes in the book of Five Rings about the void as the ground of all being, and the Zen foundation underneath the martial practices of all samurai and the practitioners. When the Meiji government issued the Haiturai in 1876, that is the prohibiting of wearing of all swords for samurai. So that was not just, you can say, not just a mere change in who could carry a weapon and who could not. Once the samurai were not able to carry their weapons, once they lost their, you can say, the honorable tradition of the privilege of being able to carry that weapon, that institutional transmission line which they passed down as a knowledge tradition hereditarily, that lost its entire basis. And as we see, the class entirely disappears within years of the Meiji Restoration, and the knowledge which was there in it, that has been that has really no body to live in anymore. You can't say that the knowledge was actually dispersed across the Japanese people either, because they began to take in, you can say, enlightenment ethics over their own. So yes, this is how knowledge and knowledge traditions disappear and there can be a parallel drawn here as well, that this is precisely analogous to what happens when a caste is dismantled in the Hindu context. That there's not just a social change, but also the loss of an entire system of transmitted knowledge, whether it be, you can say, ritual knowledge or crafts knowledge, or even ethical knowledge that was actually embedded in the various jatis. So the point of this slide is basically the loss of caste is the loss of a living tradition.
By the way, just wanted to ask you this. So, over here you have titled it as the twofold way of pen and sword. So, for us in modern times, we would say, how is this possible? Even like the pen and the sword are two very divergent stream of application. Uh, but this was, I think, enmeshed right in this practice. How do you
Yes.
think this was done? Like, how was it done at all? It
Ha,
boggles our mind.
so like I said earlier, the basis of their ethic in this whole code was both the Confucian ethics and the Zen Buddhist ethics. And Zen Buddhism particularly places an emphasis on meditation. So when you meditate, whether it be on you can say on your work or any other thing, it kind of trains the practitioner to act from a place of stillness rather than being passively reactive. And this was actually a quality which a warrior needs, if you think about it. That they must, if any situation approaches them, they should be able to respond with complete attention to what is going on without the hesitation produced by too much overthinking or being passively responsive or so on. That is also what makes a skilled martial artist at the same time. So yeah, that is the, I think, the psychological discipline behind that. The reason why you need to be trained in both ways.
Brilliant, brilliant.
So that kind of training also comes from poetry. So when they know the poetry, they also understand the deeper meanings behind their actions, right? So there is a kind of wholeness that they are training their body, their emotions, their intellect, and yeah, it is a more wholesome way of looking at things, I guess. Yeah. So that was a twofold way of the penance code. We shall now move to the actual events of the Meiji Restoration. I won't be describing the Meiji Restoration entirely. However, I will briefly go through the various things that happened. So, in December, after the Matthew Perry expedition and the opening up of Japan and so on, the issuing of the initial edicts and so on, in December 1871, the Meiji government dispatched an extraordinary diplomatic mission to the West. This was called the Iwakura mission, which was led by an ambassador named Iwakura himself. And this delegation, it went around the world, especially, particularly you can say around Europe and US, and spent 631 days noting down various aspects of Western institutions, their Western lives, and so on. So the outcomes were very specific and deliberate. For example, from Russia and Germany, they take particular inspiration from their constitution and the structure of the modern military. From Britain, they really admire the naval model from them. From France, they copy, you can say, kind of adopt the legal system structure of compulsory public education. They, at the time of making these choices, they were not incidental. They were actually genuine choices they made after looking at various different countries. Alongside this institutional borrowing came a flood of European intellectual frameworks. For example, we have the case of Herbert Spencer, who is an evolutionary social philosopher whose works are quite translated into various translations. I think 20, 30 different translations of his works were floating around Japan in those days. Another thinker was John Stuart Mill. Then there was Auguste Comte, whose positivism was quite famous in Japan at the time. And we have, of course, then this is what I meant earlier when I said that Meiji leaders imported an entire civilizational, you can say, uh, framework and not just the technology itself. They were really changing the way they saw the world itself, and that really matters.
By the way, why these four philosophers though? Like there were many. Why these four? What would you say to that?
Okay, so the particular reason why you can say, let's take Spencer for example. Spencer, he came from a position of that he could give a scientific framework to everything, which was also grounded in, you can say, the Darwinism of those days. He actually also had this theory that society itself is an organism that progresses through stages and so on. And that was very useful to the language of the Meiji intellectuals that those days, that they're progressing from barbarism towards civilization and so on, right? Then then came John Stuart Mill. He was also used for this similar purposes. You see his usual liberalism, right? The concepts of
Hmm.
freedom of speech, constitutional government, then individual rights. The vocabulary and the frameworks for this were largely taken from Mill. That was the basis of their constitutions and so on. And when it comes to Comte again, this comes firstly, of course, it touches upon the scientific framework again, which Spencer was given, but Comte also gives a space to theology. And the Meiji reformists, they kind of wanted to justify, uh, you can say, a reinterpretation of Buddhist and Shinto frameworks in light of this positivism. So yes, that is why Comte is important.
Okay, so why Rousseau at last? He's a very. I think it's just normal. I guess Rousseau was just another good intellectual at that time.
So Rousseau, maybe because you can say that it was more
He was
about
the French guy.
he was French, but the particular reason why I think he was adopted was because of the social contract theory that legitimacy of government the government, it comes from the masses, and basically the you can say that there's that concept of the consent of the governed, and that there is no divine order above them, that everything is purely about the humans itself, right? So
I
that comes
think
from Rousseau.
I think also you can maybe speak on that more, but Rousseau gave arguments in favor of state, right? State reforms and state itself.
Yes, and in general, Rousseau was a kind of the most secular guy they could pick, because
Okay, okay.
they were when they were rejecting conservative thinkers of Europe, they were rejecting Christianity as essentially.
Uh-huh.
Rousseau was not that sympathetic to Christianity.
By the way, who's this last guy you have down in the footnote? Fukuzawa Yukichi.
Ah, right, right. He is probably the single most important intellectual figure of Meiji period, and if you want to understand the Meiji project itself and how its outlook towards modernization was, probably his words itself are the most important. Like you see here, his quote is there. Uh, Once the wind of Western civilization blows to the east, every blade of grass and every tree will follow what the Western wind brings. He was completely, you can say, dazzled by the West. He believed in the whole theory of Mill about how there were civilizations from primitive civilizations and civilized civilizations. He placed East Asia, like China and Japan, into somewhere in the middle, and that Japan should move towards being civilized without caring for its neighbors and so on. So yeah, his framework was purely enlightenment era, but he was very popular in Japan. He was part of the diplomatic missions as well. And what else? He actually wrote a few books on this whole idea of civilization as well. Though I have not read the translations or anything, but yeah, he was very deeply influenced by that.
Was he like similar to some of our own 19th century intellectuals, quote unquote? Would you say that?
He did think that you can say because Japan is a smaller entity, it would be a little, you can say, a little difficult comparison. But yes, he wanted to really, really identify with the West. He wanted Japan to be part of the West or Western civilization, quote unquote. So that kind of translates to kind of people who we had in our own country, say like Ramon Roy, so on, right?
Amazing.
Yeah. Any other questions?
That's a great summary. Yeah, that's a great summary, in fact, I guess, because the kind of reforms that they took on, which you explained to us right now, from constitution to military reforms, and also these are the sociological frameworks, right, that they adopted from these philosophers. So everything is Western, like from down to ideas to the externalities as well. Mm.
Yes, yes, very much so. So I'll move on to the next slide.
Yeah, 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 you can move.
So this is an image of the Iwakuro mission itself. As you can note that a lot of the men are actually wearing Western outfits in those days, while there is one person in the middle who, Iwakuro himself, who does not wear that as the head of the mission. Here is an image of the first steam train in Japan in the 1880s, if I'm correct, which ran. You can notice the various outfits and the kind of celebration going on and so on. Here is an image of the first silk factory in the Western sense of Japan, which was built completely according to their, you can say, technology and so on. So this is an image of a rice exchange where a lot of the rice producers came to sell rice in en masse and export or import it and so on. So yes, we come to the next point then. So the Meiji leaders themselves, they were aware of the tension in what they were doing. So whether the tension about whether they were importing the frameworks wrongly and so on. Their response was that to create a slogan, particularly called Wako Nyosai. That is, they will imbibe the Japanese spirit, but also take in Western technology. So the idea was basically that we will take the tools of European modernity while we'll be keeping our inner spiritual identity intact. That the whole idea was about being strategic about what they borrow. On the face of it, it is quite a tempting idea, and it was not really stupid. It was actually thought out, and it requires a genuine recognition that something was there to be preserved at all. But as I would argue, they were really deeply naive about the nature of ideas and particularly Enlightenment ideas. So here is a problem. So civilizational framework, if you think about it, is not really a collection of separable modules. The Western civilizational framework, it falls back on the nation state model, the industrial economy, especially in the 19th century, the conscript army, the secular legal system, which was new but very widely popular in the West. Then the compulsory Western style education, which was imposed by Meiji around 1880s, if I'm correct. So each of these, they carry a kind of embedded metaphysical assumptions about what a human being's purpose in life is, what a society is for, and what constitutes legitimate authority. The Enlightenment package that they imported, that is rationalism, materialism, disenchantment of the world, progress as a value in itself, that does not stay in its designated lane. Everything, basically, my argument is that everything that this Enlightenment package touches, it basically colonizes that. For example, as we spoke of the nation state model, that assumes that the highest form of political loyalty it is to the nation as a collective, which is in, as Rene Guénon would say, who I will introduce later, purely horizontal, a purely material and worldly object of devotion. The compulsory education system, on the other hand, it also assumes that the purpose of education is to produce functional citizens for an industrial economy, which is training and not education in the traditional sense, which was far more wholesome, as we saw in the case of, um, you can say, the case of Bunbu Ryodo, the twofold way of the penance code, which was far more comprehensive and not just training in, you can say, a skill. So yeah, and when we come to the legal system, which is secular, it is based on the social contract idea of Rousseau, and it assumes the authority derives from human will, from the human mass, and not from cosmic or divine order or anything. So when we put all of these together individually, they form a kind of metaphysical claim themselves that taken together, they form a comprehensive alternative to the traditional worldview. The Meiji leaders were obviously naive that they thought they could be selective. And the evidence of the next 80 years suggests that they could not really be selective. So, just I have a quote for the audience here from Neil Postman. Embedded in every tool is an ideological bias, a predisposition to construct the world as one thing rather than another, to value one thing over another, to amplify one sense or skill or attitude more loudly than another. So that is the kind of, you can say, attitude with every tool, which every tool has in itself. So we move on to the next slide. Here is an illustration from the same period about the gentleman Japanese of with Western conditioning, teaching the, you can say, the traditional Japanese of civilization, quote unquote.
Makes me remember of the Babus here in India.
Yes, absolutely. The, you can say, the collaborator class and so on.
Yeah.
So, so among now we move on to the consequences of what happened in the early Meiji period, especially. And this is actually one of the more under discussed acts of cultural destruction in modern history that people really, really overlook at times. So, in March 1868, within weeks of the Meiji Restoration, that is, the new government issued a particular order, which is called the Shinbutsu Hanzenrai. These were basically a series of edicts that ordered the forced separation of Buddhism and Shintoism. The organic synthesis that we spoke of earlier, Shinbutsu Shugo, which actually ran for over 1,300-year period and which had shaped every aspect of Japanese spiritual life at that point. That organic synthesis was essentially declared illegal. The There was a state police sent to a lot of temples at that time and shrines. Buddhist clergy at these temples who were serving, they were actually defrocked. Frocks are basically those long dresses, right? The Shinto, you can say the Japanese priests wear. They were defrocked there. They were forced to wear other secular clothes, I guess. Then the for in any Shinto shrine, if there is Buddhist terminology used for the deities, that was explicitly banned in the orders. And if any sacred objects of the combined traditions of Shintoism and Buddhism were found together, they were to be separated, they were to be classified, and if they were found to be, in many cases, when they were Buddhist, they were to be explicitly removed. So the what followed from this was basically a whole policy called Haibutsu Kishaku, that is, abolish Buddhism and destroy Shakyamuni. And there was a whole wave of anti-Buddhist destruction that the Japanese historian Kuroda Toshio has documented in quite a lot of detail. The and the numbers are staggering, which and which is totally not talked about in modern times. Then
By the way,
whole
weren't any
number, huh?
yeah, weren't there any revolts against such a scale of destruction? I mean, this is unprecedented.
Yes, I'll just briefly complete this about what the
Okay.
scale of destruction actually was. Then I'll come to that. So basically, approximately 40,000 temples across Japan were demolished, and this was from around 100,000 Buddhist temples. That is around 40% of all temples destroyed. In a particular domain, we take the example of Satsuma domain. All the 1,600 Buddhist temples were destroyed, and around 3,000 priests, that is more than one priest for each temple, right? They were all forced to take back lay professions. By 1872, this domain, Satsuma domain, it had zero functioning Buddhist temples. Essentially, Buddhism was virtually eradicated within, you could say, 4 years of the Meiji Restoration in that domain particular. Then there is the example of a Kofukuji in Nara, which is a whole shrine complex that was founded around 1,500 years ago. And among them, there is a whole huge pagoda there, a five-story pagoda, of which I have an image here. You can look at this building. This was basically a Buddhist shrine in those days. This shrine was um, basically put up for sale and was and the buyer who actually bought it then, he wanted to burn it and sell it off for scrap metal. The only reason it was actually saved was because the neighbors were afraid of the fire from the burning of this spreading into the neighborhood. Otherwise, the whole temple was about to be burnt off. A lot of cases are there which are recorded of temple bells in Buddhist shrines being melted down, and they were sent out to military factories to make ship cannons. So this kind of a cultural revolution, it really had a magnitude you cannot even imagine in those days, and it happened within years of the Meiji Restoration. This must really be kept in mind when we think about what the effects of the assumptions of the Meiji Restoration were. About whether there were revolts against the temple destructions, yes, there were a few cases, not many. In virtually all domains, there was obviously a lot of resistance from the peasants and the Buddhist institutions themselves. The peasants and the local communities who actually built their lives around the shrines, right? They, of course, were very unhappy with the destruction of the sacred objects. There was a particular uprising and riot in Toyama domain in 1870, just 2 years after the Meiji Restoration. There was another two uprisings in Mikawa and Ise in 1871. That is 3 years after Meiji Restoration. There were small Buddhist sects which resisted in their old capacity as well. So yes, there was resistance, but it was not organized to the scale, and the Japanese state was too centralized that the people could effectively resist it. So yes, that was about Shinbutsu Bunri, that is the forced separation of Buddhism and Shinto. Here's a five-story pagoda that was nearly destroyed. It is still around today, fortunately. So now we talk about something more interesting about state Shinto as being an invented tradition. So, if in those years of the Meiji Restoration, the authentic living synthesis of Buddhism and Shintoism was destroyed, what actually remained after that? Were we, because today as well we see a lot of temples, shrines. What are we truly seeing with there actually? So after all this destruction, after all this this whole period of, you can say, reformation in a sense as well, the Meiji state, it had elevated Shinto, stripped of its Buddhist dimensions, to the status of a national tradition and eventually a state ideology itself. So there is a scholarly consensus that because of this, what the Meiji state called a restoration of ancient Shinto, it was in fact a modern construction in their sensibilities, in their enlightenment era sensibilities, essentially. So it can even be argued that before modern times, Shinto did not even exist as an independent religion because on a lot of ritualisms, a lot of, you can say, frameworks to understand itself, it relied deeply on Buddhism. This is argued by a scholar named Kuroda Toshio. There is another scholar named Jason Josephson, who in the book The Invention of Religion in Japan, he reveals that the very concept of religion itself, it had to be invented after the Meiji Restoration. The, the particular instance this comes to light is that when American warships arrived in 1853, that is the Matthew Perry expedition, right? They had a particular demand from the Japanese of instituting freedom of religion. But on the when the Japanese encountered this demand, they did not even understand what was being asked of them. They did not actually have an understanding of what a religion was. So when they they made up the category of religions itself, Shinto was excluded from religion initially by Meiji officials themselves. because they did not think it was a religion. They did not think of it as in a religion in the Western sense, at least. Instead, what they thought of Shintoism was as a national custom or a national civic obligation. You can say a civic religion in a sense. So that the practice of the Shinto, it is above the freedom of religion concept itself, and it was being made able to be made compulsory for all the people. So this is kind of a really this is a great intellectual, you can say, uh, monkey balancing done
Gymnastics.
by them,
Hmm.
intellectual gymnastics done by them to impose Shinto as above religions in a sense.
By the way, just wanted to ask you. So, when you talked about the syncretism between Buddhist and Shinto, before this policy which was taken, what was the specific tradition within that syncretism? What would you denote that tradition towards? Like later on, what it came out as invented tradition, as you will argue, right?
Right.
As you have argued. Hmm.
So, so to argue what the tradition was, we must fall back to a framework to define tradition, right? In this case, I will obviously fall back to perennialism because
Okay.
perennialists define tradition as a very specific thing. They define tradition as a living transmission of metaphysical knowledge from a transcendent source, that is, a source above the human, passed down from an unbroken chain of transmission. That is either through, you can say, from a teacher to a student, they
Hmm.
have a teacher student lineage and so on, or from a father
Yes.
son lineage, so that is a hereditary lineage, or through, you can say, institutions in another manner, or you can say
Ah,
even textual people studies texts from one to another and they become part of that lineage in a sense. So this is what perennialism calls genuine contact with traditions in our life. And this is what makes a tradition living, quote unquote, according to perennialism.
okay.
It is since they are not basically imitating what they think tradition is, they are actually
Hmm.
being taught and are conditioned by the living tradition. This kind of transmission is called genuine. So, what was tradition in Japan at this time in Tokugawa, Japan, right? That was your question.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
So that particular tradition was that, for example, we take the case of Shinto. Shinto had this deeply rooted sense of the sacredness of places. That is the living presence of divinity in nature, the specific kami that inhabited the mountains, the rivers, the communities in general, and there was the kind of Buddhist metaphysical and contemplative inheritance that was there, the path of
Okay.
meditation, analysis of mind. These traditions, which were obviously passed down in the temple shrine complexes or even in the traditions such as the samurai tradition, they were what I would define as tradition. And when the
Okay.
temples and the samurai class were abolished, you can say that transmission lines of the tradition had been severed.
So, will this? Okay, so I'm gonna posit something. You can please correct that. So,
Yes.
was this tradition like, like for example, we see right rituals and specific set of practices that happen within traditions, quote unquote. So, were these sort of functions primarily from Buddhist religion? Would you say that, like in that syncretism, was Buddhism the source for such practices, even for Shintoism as well, before
It
Meiji
seems so.
Restoration?
The argument from many scholars is that the contemplative traditions, or whenever there was an analysis of the mind, or there was a meditation on a practice, that was always falling back on the analysis of Buddhism.
Okay, got it. And
Yeah.
the divinity within nature, that was from Shintoism, as you said, right? That was the other part.
Yes.
Hmm. Okay, got it.
So yes, we move on to the next slide then. Now, I would like to introduce a new concept that is actually central to the understanding of what just happened in Japan, but also the overall arc of the argument I was trying to build. So, that the concept I'm trying to introduce is nationalism as a political religion. So, the basic observation from the perspective of perennialists is that human beings they are not wired for purely secular or a purely disenchanted existence. They always seek something that transcends them and always wish to orient themselves to something that they believe is higher than them, that they believe is sacred. Yeah. Something that transcends their individual lives and demands ultimate loyalty, and something that isn't a superstition without reason. According to perennialists, this is a structural feature of the humans, you can say. And Rene Guénon would say that this is because the human being itself is made for transcendence, which is a claim, of course, we can dispute, but yes, that is, we can keep that in mind.
By the way, uh, just to enlighten the audience, could you just, for some small instance, talk about who was Rene Guénon?
Yes, yes, we should really talk about him because he's a really important person to understand the whole frameworks that we are talking about. So, René Guénon was French and he was this intellectual of the 20th century who originally was like completely unknown in the mainstream academic circles. He had traveled around a lot and went to places like Egypt and so on. He read about Hinduism a lot, wrote a lot of books on Hinduism particularly. He read about Islam a lot. He read about Christianity, especially the, you can say, the monastic traditions, if I'm correct, Taoism, all that. So his idea was kind of a thing that we might disagree with, but it is still respectable, that all these traditions they express the same fundamental metaphysical truth, which is accessible through a perennial philosophy. And albeit these traditions are diverse in their outer forms, that he believed that the inner esoteric dimensions, that is the contemplative aspects of the religions, they were the same. Which is, of course, we can dispute that, but that is the basis of his thought. So particularly in the this context, from the topic which I am discussing, the work which is most relevant is The Crisis of the Modern World. That is the book which you can refer to if you would like to read more about the topic.
Okay. Yeah, let's get into the topic of right now, nationalism as a political religion.
Hmm. So, the René Guénon would say that the human being itself is a being made for transcendence. Yeah, and I would say that even if you don't accept this metaphysical claim, which many of us don't, and it is acceptable, you can observe the empirical pattern that whenever genuine tradition is weakened, or you can say destroyed, something else does rush in to fill the void that the empty sacred space left, right? And historically, especially in the case of Europe, and in this case on Japan, what always rushes in that empty void is nationalism or one of its cousins like political ideology. So, about nationalism itself, nationalism as a political religion has all the structural features of a genuine religion. There are, you can say, sacred objects, there is a flag, the emperor in case of Japan, the national body, um, what else? The There is an anthem in many countries. There,
The map.
yes, the map. Then there are founding myths, the stories around the founding of the country. Then there are heroes uh, among all nations. There are martyrs and saints who, quote unquote, die for the nation. There are holy days which basically become national holidays. There are compulsory rituals around this nationalism as a political religion. For example, we have in our own country about having to stand up for the national anthem and so on, which is respectable. And above all these rituals, the biggest demand of nationalism as a religion is the demand for ultimate loyalty, that there is a willingness to die for the collective that is a nation, and that by dying for the nation, we get a form of immortality by through the identification with the nation, because this nation is seen as something bigger than the individual self. But the catch here is, especially this I have borrowed from Rennie, is that nationalism, it completely lacks any genuine transcendent reference. It is oriented purely towards the horizontal, towards power, towards purity, towards glory of collective human group. It is not oriented towards something bigger than the human. So Rene Guénon, he would particularly call this the counterfeit sacred or pseudo sacred. It is a substitute that fills the vacuum when genuine transcendence has been severed. So on the face of it, it looks like a religion. It even functions like a religion because it asks for your sacrifice, it has sacred objects and so on. But it worships a nation rather than anything that transcends the people, transcends the nation. And the nation is nothing but the people. So this is purely about humans here. And my thesis is essentially this, that this is what was exactly constructed in Meiji, Japan, step by step.
Frankly, this is shattering. Like, it really debunks so many of our conceptions, because rarely such discussions take place within our context, especially with regards to nationalism and how it is, as you said, counterfeit sacred.
Absolutely. It is a topic very less discussed among, you can say, non-left circles. Left circles kind of talk about it, but in a very berating fashion. They have their
Yeah,
own sacred, which is also counterfeit sacred.
true.
Um, and yes, that is a competition between counterfeit sacreds in this manner. Then, so yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
I should move on to the next slide then. So, about what happened next in Japan. The We talk about the Kokutai. So the institutional vehicle for this political religion that was instituted in Japan in the form of nationalism, it was the concept of Kokutai, that is the national body. So originally this concept actually started with particular 1825 text called Shinron, far before the Meiji Restoration, by a person named Aizawa Seishi Sai. So Aizawa had also observed with also a lot of clarity actually that Western powers were using Christianity to bind their subjects to the state and facilitate conquest and colonization very effectively. His idea was basically that Japan needed its own equivalent uh, to make sure that their people do not lose the bond between the state and the you can say the people, and that the sacred bond between the people, emperor, and land, that would give the nation the cohesion it needed to resist foreign pressure. So his idea was purely strategic and also innovative in a sense, but as you know, it can backfire as well. So in the Meiji period, this strategic concept, it was institutionalized. As you can see in the presentation, in 1890, the Imperial Rescript on Education was issued. So it was a short document demanding absolute loyalty to the emperor, framed in terms of filial piety, that is, uh, seeing the emperor as your own family and serving him as a family obligation and so on, and that the serving the emperor was a cosmic obligation, a divine obligation, and its commands of this edict, they were described as coeval with heaven and earth. The copies of this were, of course, sent to every school in Japan during the compulsory education. Students had to recite it while kneeling. There were special shrine-like cabinets built across offices or you can say government institutions across the country for this particular imperial script, that they would keep it in the shrine, and they would you can say bow to it or pray to it and so on. and and there were famously some cases of teachers dying saving these texts from burning buildings, because the penalty for damaging a burning copy of one of these was very, very severe.
Wow, more sacred
Yes,
than their own
so
life.
yes, they are more sacred than the building. And this obviously got into a very dangerous dimension going forward. By 1937, another pamphlet which was issued, the same, you can say, importance, the Kokutai no Hongi, that is a 156-page pamphlet, which articulated the whole theology, which defined this emperor as divine, and was, of course, again the same thing. Stick happened. They were issuing millions of copies, made it compulsory in every school. And in 1938, after that, a Buddhist association, which was, of course, directed by the government itself, it had to declare that the principal image of adoration in Buddhism in Japan was not the Buddha, it was actually the emperor themselves. So that you can kind of contemplate what the outcome of this was, that Buddhism, which was a 2,500-year-old tradition at that point, all that had been condensed into a vehicle just for the worship of the Japanese emperor. So
So,
this is what we mean by pseudo sacred.
hmm. So while you were explaining this slide, you had told us about how there was something um like this sort of framework was brewing up during 16th century, right, when Christian missionaries were entering Japan. So
Yes.
I wanted to ask you, that was a bit pragmatic approach, right? But was this the same case over here as well when the emperor was doing so-called uh, this same project, getting inspired from that old text? Was it the same case? Just wanted to ask you.
Um, no, it was not. But the basis, it can be made, the argument can be made that the original text, which was made before the Meiji Restoration, that could be the basis for the same arguments that the later forms of this, you can say, edicts transformed into. So it was already a disaster in the waiting to happen, in a sense.
Oh no. Okay.
So overall, you can say that they were right that Japan needs to avoid colonization and they need to bind the people to the state. But doing this while importing the Enlightenment framework, that really failed. You can argue that.
True, true, true. Yeah, I think
So
we can move
yes,
on.
this is painting of Emperor Meiji actually issuing the res- rescript, the 1891. And you can notice here as well, many of the people are actually wearing Western outfits, except for the woman here. This is another image of the same time. So we move on to the next slide. So I want to be a little careful here because I'm not making a crude claim that Meiji Restoration caused the events of what Japan did in the Second World War or anything, but we are making a more precise argument about the mechanism. So, of course, as we discussed, when genuine transcendence is severed and replaced by pseudo sacred substitute, which is oriented towards national collective, that is the people, when the sacred is redirected from the vertical, that is towards something that exceeds human will, to the horizontal, that is the nation as a divine racial civilizational entity, that result is really bad. The result is basically a quality of collective certainty and collective violence that a tradition still rooted in genuine transcendence would resist. So, um, just to elaborate on the point, a tradition with a vertical axis, so with something that has a genuine sense of something as sacred above it, that tends to produce restraint because there is something above you. Your nation, your emperor, your personal will, all that is subject to reality. So there is a true limit on it. And this is also what Buddhism teaches, right? That there is a orientation of compassion which you must show toward in reality. Even in Shinto, in its genuine forms, in the local and organic forms, it basically argues for the practitioner to orient themselves to be in harmony with nature. However, the state Shinto that was being constructed by the Meiji Restoration, that created a framework in which the nation itself was the sacred object, and that of course the emperor himself was divine, and that the loyalty to this nation and emperor was the highest spiritual obligation. So, in this kind of a framework, the critical judgment becomes problematic, right? The limits don't even exist because the limits are really defined by this human himself, the emperor, and the humans, that is the nation. You have to defend every action the nation does, you have to defend every action the emperor does, while also remembering they are humans. So the result is predictable, of course, that the capacity for collective violence of the Japanese that expressed itself in China, in Southeast Asia, in the Pacific, in events like Pearl Harbor, or uh, in, I believe, Shanghai, Nanking, and other places. That happened with a quality and scale that really shocks the world, even to this day. So, yeah, the argument basically is that the road to this catastrophe that it ran directly through the Meiji project, not as an accident, but as a consequence of it.
Indeed, indeed. Uh, was this also the case that right, those philosophers, the those philosophers from whom they were taking inspiration, was some sort of social Darwinism imbibed within that whole process of Meiji Restoration into the state as it was existing then within Japan?
Yes, yes. As I talked earlier, there was a particular intellectual called Fukuzawa Yukiji, right? And he had the whole framework of civilizations, which he, of course, borrowed from John Stuart Mill and others. This civilizationism itself is a product of Darwinism, which and the civilizationism they talk of course, divides people into barbarians and civilizations. So when the Japanese actually imposed themselves on the, you can say, the Chinese or the Koreans and others, they really did not. They thought that they were there to civilize them in a sense. It is a lot in a way. It is kind of a repeat of European colonization.
Wow. I
So
think we can
yes,
move on, right?
yes, we can move on. So August 15, 1945. This is what happens on the once the war is really over. The nuclear bombs have been dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan is really defeated in the war and so on. So the emperor, who was supposed to be a living god, he he is forced to come on radio by the Americans. It was the first time most Japanese people actually heard his voice, even, and it was so he had to admit that he was human, that he was mortal, and that Japan had lost. So within that whole year, or you can say within the span of 1 year, 2 years, right? The whole pseudo sacred constructs of Meiji Japan, they were entirely deconstructed. In January 1, 1946, the American occupation authorities actually asked him to publicly renounce his divine status, even. And the
Wow.
American occupational authorities even actually went about systematically deconstructing the institutional infrastructure of the political religion. All the, you can see the symbolisms, everything was deconstructed in every sense it could be done. So, yes, so what was dismantled in the argument I'm trying to make is that in 1945 and 1946, after, in the aftermath of the World War II, what was dismantled was not ancient tradition, it was just a recent invention. And the genuine tradition, which was actually the living synthesis of Buddhism and Shinto, that was long dead, which had been destroyed more thoroughly 80 years earlier through the various policies of the Meiji period, early Meiji period. So after 1945, you see that Japan has really no authentic spiritual life to draw on. The institutions that it used to have, which it could have drawn from, that is the samurai class, the temple shrine complexes, and so on, they were long gone by then. So in 1945, Japan was essentially a tree whose branches had been violently cut. It was also a tree whose roots had been severed long, long ago, and the tree came collapsing in 1945.
Just a small question. So many years of believing in such pseudo sacred traditions or invented traditions that they had made. And after this, on August 5, 1945, what do you think would have been the consequence at that time amongst Japanese population? At least some impressions, if you have, you could please share it with us right now.
I suppose the kind of impression I get is that they just went about accepting it because the conditions were so dire at the time. People were just looking for food, looking for a place to stay because there was a huge bombing and everything was
Yeah.
virtually destroyed and stuff. They were so focusing their energies on rebuilding everything that they accepted it that they lost and stuff. But yeah,
Wow.
the spiritual aspect of it, I guess they kind of hollowed their own beliefs out that we really went wrong. That really rings in their mind, I suppose.
Hmm. I guess also
This
there was
happened in the
nothing
case
to
of
go back.
Japan, in Germany as well, right?
Okay, okay. Yeah, yeah, sure. Indeed, indeed, indeed. That as well happened over there.
So here I would like to discuss with all our guests as well about what contemporary Japan is more like now after the downstream conditions that were created in the aftermath of World War II and the Meiji Restoration. So, of course, I'm not describing contemporary Japan with contempt or anything, because the Japanese, they have actually built, uh, you can say, a country of extraordinary sophistication, a lot of technological excellence, which is genuinely admirable, even aesthetic refinement in their arts and culture, right? This is very true and it really deserves some acknowledgement. But Alongside these achievements, there is also a lot of social phenomena that are genuinely striking, and I think that they are underexplained by standard sociological frameworks, which I think our framework might be able to explain. So, as you can see in the image in the presentation, we talk about the phenomena of hikikomori, of needs that over a million people, disproportionately young and so on, they have withdrawn from public social life entirely. They are not working, not in education or so on. Then there is a case of Parush, that is, there is a very severe overworking culture, then that they had to actually coin a name for it. Japan even has the lowest birth rates among most countries of the world. And so, yeah, these kind of strange social phenomena that Japan is experiencing in modern times, I believe that they have some roots in the um, events of 1868 and so on.
Hmm. Indeed. Uh,
Because
Patriot.
this is a sign of a civilization that has law that after creating pseudo sacred substitute for its original sacred, they have really no alternative to prop up anymore, except for the materialism and so on, right?
True, 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 true. That's the only avenue they have to express themselves, I guess. Also, I think there is this culture over there, right, in Japan. So they they commodify Japan itself, their own nation. So every even institutions, everything down to human beings, everything is a showcase piece for the world to look at. At least that's what I get. That's the impression I get. I may be wrong completely.
In a sense, that is true. It does look like a living museum, in a sense,
Hmm.
because all of its artifacts of its past, of its present, they are essentially just items to be commodified and to be, I guess, glazed at by spectators
Yeah.
and so on. They have no meaning by themselves to the Japanese or to others.
True, 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 true. Also, there is this. What should I say? Um, you have referred to here, right? You referred here herbivore culture, where there are no interactions between the opposite sexes, but there is also this deviancy as well, right? I guess within hikikomori community, it would be seen much more. Very much obsessed
Yes,
with a particular sense of sexual orientations and so on.
very much so. And they're very weirdly exhibitive about these things in comparison with even other Western countries. So, yeah, that was about the downstream conditions. We can move on to the next slide then. So, here we can take a little step back and now we can look at the larger claim that this whole story is pointing towards. So, the argument is that what happened in Japan is not a unique historical quirk or anything, but it is an instance of a recurring pattern that always plays out when a traditional civilization encounters particularly this idea of Western modernity under conditions of pressure. So the the pattern is something like this, that a traditional civilization rooted in genuine metaphysical and religious inheritance, it faces the threat of Western imperial power either through direct colonialism or the threat of the colonialists. So then the modernizing elite, they respond by being very selective when they are constructing a new national identity in response to this threat. This identity, it borrows from traditional inheritance, but it reshapes it for their modern purposes in a way. So the tradition itself becomes very compressed. That what was a wholesome view of life, it becomes a vehicle for nationalist mobilization in a sense. So the outer forms are preserved or amplified even, while the inner metaphysical life is virtually hollowed out. This is what is seen in the case of the Meiji Restoration. So yes,
Hmm.
that is the whole case here. Any questions on this?
Uh, Not really. We could have discussed this, but okay. I think you have made your point amazingly
Yes.
over here.
Okay, so another point here. So, why I also think this matters in the case of India, we shall come back to this briefly, but the kind of compression that I talked of the wholesome view and the whole living metaphysical orientation that the religion gives us, that being reduced to being a vehicle for nationalist mobilization, that is a pattern we also see in case of India. So we often see things like um, symbols being made, you can say religious symbols being made political identity markers, then designations of foreigners and concepts being made a boundary against the other, when it is a more something about defining oneself on one's own terms. And of course, there are other factors as well. We should come back to this briefly, and the review. I would like the viewers to also give their thoughts on this.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Of course.
So, uh, we come now to the meta argument, which is even
Hmm.
above the previous argument now. So, what is the nature of modernity itself? The nature here that we talk of here is that modernity does not simply arrive and add things to a traditional civilization. It does not act in a complementary manner. It The argument is that uh, modernity restructures it from ground up, and particularly it does so by attacking a specific thing, that is the vertical axis of the civilization. So, as you might have been hearing, I few times I had been talking about the vertical axis and the horizontal axis of civilizations. So I'll
Yes.
elaborate a bit on that. So every
Okay.
traditional civilization that we are aware of, it orients itself around a vertical axis. That is a sense that the social and natural order is grounded in something that is bigger than the human. That is something more that is not comprehensible to human will. Say it may be called the divine, the sacred, and the specific names differ across traditions, right? But the strict structure is roughly the same, that there is something above us, something before us, something that we do not invent in, but we can participate in by uh, participating in traditions. The role of tradition also is to transmit this orientation towards this um divine that is bigger than us cross generations. So that is the meaning of tradition in its fundamental sense. So modernity, though, it completely substitutes the horizontal, sorry, the vertical. The
Yeah.
Enlightenment, it because the Enlightenment era values, they place the autonomous human being at the center of the cosmos. So society eventually becomes a contract between individual wills. So progress is then the accumulation of human-made improvements, not something divinely oriented. Everything that was once grounded in something transcendent is now grounded in something purely based on human desire. So this kind of a metaphysical shift is perhaps one of the most profound kind. The tree that of any civilization can keep standing for a long time after its roots are severed, because we keep getting the fruits of it, and Japan did get the fruits of it till date. It gets the fruits of the civilization inheritance it has. However, The tree without its roots, that will not survive a true storm. And as you saw in Japan's case, it did not really survive World War II with the kind of distortions it had done to its own inheritance.
True. Absolutely true.
Hmm.
Also, we can
So,
say this as well, right? Right now, in modern
uh,
nations, we see they say, right, Western values. So, what are the Western values? Those are geared towards what you said, right? In fulfilling human desires. So, freedom is a great value. Liberty is a great value because all of these increase the uh, uh, capacity of human desires to be fulfilled, I guess. Maybe you can correct me on this.
yes, and the fundamental difference is that they are oriented purely towards the human, not something bigger than the human.
Hmm.
A civilization, according to the perennialist framework, something that actually orients itself on an axis where there's something greater than the human, and that is
Hmm.
acknowledged, and you can say, we transmit that orientation towards throughout generations with tradition.
True, true. Hmm. On this slide.
So, elaborating on this, I would like to continue on the next slide. So there are a category of questions that every human civilization must find a way of answer, right? That the deepest ones, that why are we here? Or what do we owe each other? And how do we face death finally? And what is the place of human beings in the world, right? So the argument from perennialists usually is, and in the case of Japan as well, is that the traditional civilizations, they build themselves around the answers to these questions. So not as just academic exercises or just philosophical, uh, you can say, monkey balancing or anything, but they actually base their institutions and cultural life on this. So the temple, as an example, it is not merely a building, but it is actually the architectural answer to where the sacred dwells. And for example, we often simplify a career to a simple job, right? But a job is a really sacred thing in a more traditional framework, because for example, the samurai's daily practice of his job, that would be essentially kind of a practice of a philosophy even.
Hmm.
So there is an answer that the traditional civilizations have to these questions. But modernity, it always outsources the answers to these questions. For example, the first question that is on the presentation, why are we here? How does modernity answer that? Usually, the answer will be that this answer is personal, and everyone has a different answer to it. So it's a private choice whether they have an answer or not, or they have the answer that they have no choice in being here, that it was purely random choice, chance that they were born, and so on. Then what would be the second question's answer? What do we owe each other? Secular individuals who conform to modernity, they would simply say that we owe each other only what is told us to owe each other by law. So the state's law becomes sacred to them, pseudo sacred to them in that sense. The final question, how do we face death? This is a question which they don't have an answer to, but they always have the answer that medicine, we look to medicine to push our death further away. When it finally comes, we shall face it alone. So everything is oriented around the individual, and nothing, and the individual himself is sovereign. And the sovereignty means that individual is truly on his own. The anything that was sacred above him does not care about the individual. That is the view of modernity.
Completely drastic and totally opposite of what traditional cultures actually convey in these cases. Rather, these answers from modernity is like it's just a what should I say? Like they are not even trying to engage with it because it's so revolting to them.
Yes,
That's what I
and
feel at
you can
least.
kind of see it in our contemporary society as well, that all these answers are actually being demonstrated by our daily lives itself. That we
Hmm.
can have extraordinary achievements or extraordinary refinement in various tasks, but we don't have an orientation to connect those achievements to why they matter in the larger scheme of things, right?
Yeah.
It is it is purely just for human desire.
Hmm. Completely, and that's when we see the downward progression towards degeneracy. That even though society is technologically superior, but the human beings themselves are going just crazy, I guess.
Yes. So moving on to the next slide, which is the final slide. I want to close this not with a verdict or any particular judgment, but rather with a question for the audience, so that because the honest position is to hold the question open rather than to reach too quickly for an answer here. So, if what we described today is actually accurate, that if what modernity does to traditional civilizations is actually a pattern, as in seen in the Meiji Restoration, then what follows? Are we arguing for a simple return to tradition? Are we arguing that Meiji Restoration they should bring back samurai or institute or whatever institutions they had exactly the way they wanted? No, that cannot really happen, because genuine traditions, once the living transmission lines have been severed, they simply don't reassemble themselves. The temple can be rebuilt, but the lineage of you can say the priests who actually carry knowledge of various intricacies about how to manage the temple, they cannot be reconstructed by any in any fashion whatsoever. And of course, we are not idealizing the traditional societies as having no problems at all, that the being in a technological backwater is the solution to everything. No, that is not our argument at all. There were even injustices happening in traditional society, and those deserve honest acknowledgement as well. But what we are arguing for is something more specific, right? That the framework that we evaluate what counts as progress, that deserves examination, because what we are calling modernization all this while, it is not a neutral technical process, but actually a comprehensive substitution for a sacred one that carries enormous costs, which we till now have left unseen, and which the standard narrative does not account for. And that those of us who live in a civilization that still has living roots to some extent, in India specifically, even though it is pressured in many ways and threatened in all possible ways we can imagine, there is still the question worth asking seriously and with clear eyes, that what are we trading away when we are bringing modernity here? And once we are trading it away, can we assure ourselves that we can get it back? So yeah, that I would like to close with that, because
Yeah.
just for the audience to have a to see Japan's story as a warning and a mirror to what the future can look like even in India. A
True.
final quote I would like to give from an individual, Ludwig Wittgenstein: tradition is not something a man can learn, not a thread he picks up when he feels like it, any more than a man can choose his own ancestors. Someone lacking a tradition who would like to have one is like a man unhappily in love. Yes, so that was our
Brilliant.
presentation.
Brilliant exposition. What a brilliant exposition. I would request the audience to please consider this, today, especially today's presentation, seriously, because this also affects our own individual lives as well. One of the points, this will be my last submission, at least for this segment. So Nainer talked about how uh, what we are not encouraging people, especially to get this message that we should be in backwaters as far as technology is concerned. No, that is not our message. Indeed, what we are saying is this: when we talk about technology, as Nainer has explained to us before as well, technology has its own biases, and those are from very specific ideologies. And as we have seen in today's presentation, those are from a framework which is in horizontal axis, which will only and only gear towards human desires. What we have to do is now shift that gear. At least that's my take. At least we have to shift this gear towards vertical axis and orient our technological reforms from that axis. Now, if we try that out, I think we will not be technologically backward at all, but we will have a very different framework from which we will try progressing in technological advancements. And that will be a very good way to put our society, I think, at least, because the way that we are doing it right now, it's putting us in jeopardy, and it's really taking us down. And if we as humans go down, then what's the need of technology at all? Like, what are we doing by using that technology if the basis for it is totally getting us towards decadency, at least? Yeah. Niner, any points if you had?
Yes, I completely agree with your view. And if there are any audience questions, we can take them at this point. And if anyone wanted to join the conversation as well, we are going to paste the link.
If at least what I'm seeing, Niner, there aren't any right now. Maybe they are busy watching. You know, I think
IPL,
we will not. Yeah, we will not insult our audience, but yeah, uh,
sure, sure.
things go. Yeah. So I think because this is such a great topic, we will make a session on this in our next segment, I guess, in coming weeks, where we will have reactions from audiences, and we'll get to know what their views are on today's session. Because right now we are not seeing many people.
Yes. And perhaps we can discuss a little bit more on this pattern we have seen in the context of Indian tradition, or you can say Indian modernity. So, Rajya Krantikari and Rishi, what are your thoughts on this? That how exactly do you see in our context we are facing the problems?
Yeah, so in our context, we are seeing that traditional Hindu concepts very nominally are being selected, especially those which are easier to construct. Especially those which are easier for the purpose of constructing the new political paradigm, or the new political identity marker. So over here in this slide, as you are showing, uh, the upcoming political marker that is getting inspired from Hindu lands being sacred. This doctrine that we have, that this country, uh, mm, I should say, this whole earth is sacred, and in that the earth, and in that this piece of land, this Bharatavarsha, is especially sacred because there are sacred sites over here. This whole country has been traversed by our rishis, devatas come over here, so on and so forth. But all of these concepts are shoved aside because, as we know, transcendent is not really palatable for modern society. So only some of the parts, vague parts which can be taken to construct the new political paradigm, those are being taken over here, especially the part where Hindu land is sacred. That is being transposed into, okay, this nation is sacred. But when we go deep inside, then we'll see that, oh no, they are talking about India as the nation state. That's the message that they're putting it out. Next is the pointer that you have made, that you have hinted towards, designation of a foreigner. So from historical times, the religious tradition has this conception of who's a foreigner: Yavana, Turushka, Mlecha, Pulinda, Shaka, so on and so forth. These labels have been used various times. We have seen, uh, even in 18th century, just before British colonization, we have within Marathi scholarly circles texts referring to Shyamalas. Who are Shyamalas? Well, those are Abyssinians, who are the present day Siddhi community. uh, Shamalas, they are foreigners. So then Valandas, the Dutch, uh, the there are words for Portuguese as well, Firangi, Angraj, so on and so forth. So this was done from a very religious perspective. Actually, there was a traditional justification for such nomenclature, but this has not been used for modern context to say, okay, we are Indians, then there is Pakistani, there is Ukrainian, there is Chinese, there is Tibetan, so on and so forth. So that's the transformation that is happening right now. Next is the point that over here, which is being referred to, temple reclamation movements. So these movements have been going on from the times of invasion itself. So traditional society will rise up and launch movements to reclaim the sacred spaces. Again and again, they will fight. They will keep on fighting if they fail at some point of time, because this is a long war. It's a long drawn game, and the one who has patience gets to win the situation. So from that perspective, it was launched at that time. But now that has totally transformed into a scenario where temple reclamation movements are they are transformed into a scheme for national mobilization. So we as a set of people, regardless of religion, even that's also said, because the temple is a it's not now anymore a symbol of a religion or a very specific sect. No, it's a symbol for national rejuvenation. So all people, regardless of whatever religion they may believe, even if those religions reject the very purpose of that temple, still, because this is a national project, therefore they should also be joined in as well in this endeavor. So this is also what we see. And at last, festival celebrations, utsavas and all, these were done for honoring the deity itself. Like we are celebrating an event of that, uh, what should I say, some specific lila in that deity's life, uh, which happens at a certain point of time, that is celebrated by the devotees. So Diwali, Holi, Janmashtami, so on and so forth. These are not just times for social collaboration alone. No, these are times for actually celebrating that divinity itself. But that is lost over here. Now we see it's being transformed into just outer forms where light shows happen, functions happen, movies are released. um, the divinity side has receded totally. Some sort of propagandas are mentioned at that period to create controversies and so on and so forth. So these are the things, at least that's what I'm realizing. Um, all of you over here can comment on it much more. Yeah.
Uh, some very thoughtful points were brought up right now by Rishi. I'd like to add to them. So basically, what we understand is that with time, since the environment around us has changed, and the dynamics themselves, the different waves of thought have entered, our religion has accommodated them to a certain extent. For example, when the need to serve the society was fully understood and internalized, we opened this, like, ashrams exist for that. We have ashrams to serve the society while keeping the temple, retaining the temples as sacred spaces. So the utsavas are opportunities for the deity to, I mean, for celebrating the leelas of the deity in public, allowing the masses to participate in that leela, while ashramas are areas where people from different sampradayas can interact. However, now we see that even, like, earlier we had the concept of different sampradayas where different sampradayas would sit and argue on certain points of common interest, and maybe differ with one another, and where, so, like, pundits would have their mimamsa sessions where they would try to find common ground. Those were not held within temple premises, because the temple is the house of the deity. The house of the deity must not be breached for mundane causes. The temple is a space where devotees come and gather, offer their respects to the deity, and leave. That is all. So it's like the devotee's primary residence. For other activities, we had the ashram. Now we see that now the world is getting involved, because now we have tourists wanting to participate in this experience. Just for accommodating them, we shouldn't open the doors of the temple towards them, because that would be inappropriate and it would violate the protocol. Which is why we now see cultural centers coming up. Like, we know Akshardham, a new age temple, a new age cultural center has opened, which accommodates people from all walks of life. So I believe that the way to go forward would be, besides having temples and ashrams, we allow cultural centers to accommodate these interests. Cultural centers will have, the kind of things that modern people want: photo booths, ice cream booths, maybe information pamphlets, and whatever the kind of experience tourists actually want, rather than accommodating their fancy interests in the temple premises. I mean, modern problems require modern solutions. So, if a certain target audience wants light and sound shows, they want that kind of engagement, the temple should not change its protocols to accommodate those. Rather, since we already have this provision for opening new institutions, we might as well accommodate those people in cultural centers. I believe that would be
Yes,
an intelligent way going forward.
that can be a good pragmatic solution towards bringing back modernity in line with tradition, I guess. So, yes, are there any audience questions right now? I don't see any audience questions as of now.
So our point is, basically, we are not rejecting modernity, but we are accommodating it appropriately by not violating our existing protocols, by not violating the existing quote unquote way of life. We create parallel avenues for it.
Exactly. The principles on which our original, or you can say our traditional society was built, without compromising on those in a limited space, we can accommodate from modernity outside the traditional spaces, in a sense.
Yes. Cultural
Like you
centers and
said,
museums are modern outfits. There's nothing
Correct.
stopping us from opening other cultural centers and museums.
Absolutely. At the same time, we have to hold a kind of a hierarchy between these cultural centers and the original sacred spaces,
Yes,
because the sacred
temples are
spaces themselves.
residences. They should be treated like private residences. Residences have rules.
Yes, yes. And basically, we have to have that hierarchy in mind, that the sacred spaces
Yes.
themselves are always going to be more important than you can say, the materialist oriented cultural spaces.
For example, the difference between a wildlife sanctuary and a zoo. In a wildlife sanctuary, you cannot enter beyond a certain limit because then you are breaching into their natural habitat. But in a zoo, there's no such rule. Like in a zoo is open to all, and a zoo is basically for entertaining tourists. So there's that too.
Yes. Oh, yes, yes. Yeah, that's the natural habitat in case of the wildlife sanctuary,
Yes,
and
exactly.
in case of the zoo, it's for the materialist persuasion of the human.
Yes, the zoo basically wants to make money, and that money goes to the government. A wildlife sanctuary, like tourists, many tourists even need special permission to enter wildlife sanctuaries. There are certain wildlife sanctuaries which don't even allow tourists to enter
Yep,
beyond
yep.
the outer
Usually, it's
beltway.
national parks which allow, not
Yes,
the wildlife
exactly,
sanctuaries.
exactly. Because there, the priority is uh, allowing the animals and plants to flourish in their natural environment, undisturbed.
Yeah, absolutely. So yes, that was our whole uh, presentation about nationalism,
So
about
there too, there is this
modernity.
concept of, I mean, there too, we are holding certain values sacred. So understand that the temples, the moment we call them sacred space, we attach that importance to them. That means there are certain protocols and guidelines that regulate who can enter the temple and for what.
Yes,
So
because
random
sacred is
seekers,
always defined as
exactly,
something above what the human himself can
exactly.
define, right?
It's not for sightseeing. A temple is not for sightseeing. It's not a sight to be, you know, to entertain the eyes.
Mm,
Similar arguments. Huh.
so this point I had. So, do you think that because of that horizontal access thing, we have turned every avenue into a sort of space for fulfilling what the human desires? So, a foreigner now who's not a practitioner will now demand to have uh, a uh, what should I say, participation within the temple ritual. Like they desire it, therefore we must allow it to happen. Like that sort of psychology is happening, right?
Yes, and
That
also
they're trying to
because
subject
in
it to
many cases,
individual choice.
and in many cases because I mean, the money they are willing to pay is so. I mean, the government bodies must be firm in this regard.
Absolutely. Any
For
final
that, the
points from
government,
all of you? I think we can, since there are no comments as well, we can wrap
yeah,
it from here.
I think we must try to understand the vertical axis much better now, because we have started to like we are starting to see the decadency in very advanced, technologically advanced societies, especially Japan. So right now, if we do not take this as a warning, as you said over here, the Japan story is not only Japan's; it's a warning and a mirror. If we do not see our reflection in it, then we'll be doomed later on, because we are getting into that path as well right now, slowly and steadily.
Absolutely. The kind of modernization that is coming to us is essentially the same kind of that is facing that Japan is facing or the West is facing right now.
Yes. And we have those rows, what should I say, that lens, right? That, okay, we need to modernize ourselves faster. We are so poor and so on. And we need to um, now fast track that option. But in that, we stop analyzing them, we stop being skeptic, and lo and behold, we see some sort of degeneracy cropping up here and there in India, as we are seeing in urban centers especially. Yeah, others can please comment their last submissions.
Mm. Yeah. So yes, we can wrap up from here.
Okay,
Uh, Thank you to all the
amazing.
viewers, and please do leave a comment stating exactly how you found the presentation and your thoughts on how exactly India should face modernity and what are the lessons for you personally from the story that I narrated about the Meiji Restoration. So yeah, thank you to all the viewers. Jai Shri Ram.
Jai Shri Ram.